When Canadian Arabs feel they are targets of racism, is this because of how Arabs and Muslims are generally depicted in the Western media? Many believe the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is central in shaping North Americans' views towards Arabs.
Well, for the Arab community is a paramount. It's one of the main dominant injustice perceived by Arab here in Canada or in the Arab street, as people call it, the Arab street.
The Arab-Israeli conflict spills over into the coverage of course, the Middle East, and spills over into the coverage of Arab Americans and Arab Canadians, including Christians, and by extension Muslims as well.
Haroon Siddiqui is an editorial writer for the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest daily newspaper.
Once we have understood that we have a great deal of goodwill for Israel, the goodwill translates into ill will for Arabs, then it also by extension means that what we have seen is that history is never properly recognized. It's a one-sided history that we are told.
The Arab and Palestinian communities feel the North American media gives a distorted and one-sided picture of this conflict.
الميديا الأجنبية ما بتورجي الحقيقة. يعني أنا كفلسطينية عشت تحت الاحتلال سنوات طويلة من عمري وعارفة شو اللي بيحصل هناك.
Sabrina Foucault was born in Palestine and now lives in Mississauga, Ontario with her family.
بس لما باجي بسمعها على الإذاعات الأمريكية ولا الغربية بشكل عام ملهاش علاقة بالحقيقة. وللأسف الناس بيصير لهم زي غسيل دماغ إنه ما عندهم يدوروا على الحقيقة ويبحثوا ويشوفوا هل هذا الكلام صح ولا لا.
So what is the story the mainstream media seems to be missing? The dominant narrative is of a historically oppressed people, victims of the slaughter of the Holocaust, seeking refuge in their ancient land, only to be confronted at every turn by Arabs who are terrorists and remorseless anti-Semites. Wars and much bloodshed have followed as these irrational Arabs and Muslim extremists try to kill Jews.
The basic idea is that you have a group of Jews escaping an unsafe Europe to a place they believe is their ancient homeland.
Ilan Pape is Jewish and Israeli, and an Oxford-educated historian who has written books on the founding of Israel.
The reality on the ground is that the more people move into Palestine, the more the danger for the indigenous people is that they would be dispossessed and lose their own country.
Indeed, this conflict has another narrative. Up until the late 1940s, Palestine was a country controlled by the British, with a population overwhelmingly Arab who were struggling under colonial rule and aspiring for independence. The Palestinian struggle for nationhood flared into open revolt during the 1930s.
The British crushed not just the rebellion, but also the Palestinian leadership. And less than 8 years before the Palestinian catastrophe, the Palestinians had no military capacity and had no significant leadership.
At the very same time, European Jews were witnessing the rise of fascism and increasingly violent anti-Semitism. Jews from Europe began to move to Palestine, although by the beginning of World War II, they constituted less than a third of Palestine's overall population. What changed everything was the Holocaust that led to the extermination of 6 million Jews.
I think the impact of the Holocaust on the situation in Palestine was twofold. On the one hand, it totally undermined the moral position of the Palestinians that in any other circumstances in the post-Second World War atmosphere would have been totally accepted by the West. The second impact is that the Zionist leadership begins to Nazify the Palestinians. They create the impression that although the Holocaust is over, the danger of another Holocaust is not gone. You are entitled to defend yourself at any means in your disposal, and you should not, and nobody is allowed to criticize you.
When we come back, the Palestinians pay a heavy price. In spite of bearing no responsibility for the Holocaust, the Palestinians have paid an enormous price for this monstrous crime. Right after the Second World War, Jews in the tens of thousands sailed from Europe to Palestine with the aim of establishing their own country. The problem was there were already Arabs living there. As a result, a war broke out in 1948, resulting in the expulsion of 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians from their land by Jewish settlers. To the Palestinians, this event became known as النكبة, the catastrophe.
النكبة هي بداية المعاناة للشعب الفلسطيني، هي بداية كل حاجة سيئة حصلت في التاريخ الفلسطيني لحد هلا. ناس تهجرت من بيوتها، مذابح ارتكبت بحق ناس أبرياء، أراضي انسرقت من أصحابها، ناس لسه مفاتيح بيوتهم وخرائط بيوتهم معاهم بس للأسف ممنوعين إنهم حتى يدخلوا يشوفوها.
The catastrophe itself happens in less than a year, where half of Palestine's population is being forcefully dispossessed by the Jewish army. Half of Palestine's villages are destroyed, and half of Palestine's urban centers are being demolished. The classical theoretical literature about what an ethnic cleansing operation is all about, the ideological background, the strategy, the execution, all really show that the case of Palestine is a conventional case study. You cannot solve the current problems in Palestine and Israel if you don't go back to 1948.
Another consequence of the creation of Israel and of Al-Nakba was that most Jews living in Arab countries were either made to feel unwelcome in those lands or simply feared for their long-term security. As a result, about 800,000 Jews left the Arab world over the next 2 decades, most of whom settled in Israel. Meanwhile, the new state of Israel soon had the backing of European powers and the United States. The plight of the Palestinians grew worse in 1967, after the Six-Day War, when Arab nations tried to recapture Palestine for the Palestinians and were soundly defeated. Israel now occupied more land, including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Despite UN resolutions demanding the return of this territory to Palestinians, the Israelis have refused and instead began building a network of illegal settlements on it. They now control every aspect of the Palestinians' lives in these occupied territories.
They have altered the demographic character by establishing around 300,000 settlers. They have annexed East Jerusalem, which is an occupied territory. They have established circumventing roads exclusively for the Jews in the West Bank and Gaza, and they have established crossroads which are so difficult for the Palestinian Arabs. So this is a treatment of the Palestinians in their homeland as if they are intruders on it.
Clovis Maqsoud is a Lebanese lawyer, journalist, academic, and former ambassador to the UN, who says guilt is the reason for the West's support of Israel.
There is a built-in bias started from the sense of a collective guilt by the West about the Holocaust, because, for example, in the United States, they did not allow Jewish immigration from Germany during the 30s and early 40s, and therefore they want to compensate for a guilt about the Holocaust which the Arabs did not participate in.
هدف الاحتلال الإسرائيلي طمس أي حاجة بتقول إنه هذه الأرض كان إلها ناس وكان إلها أصحاب وبيطالبوا فيها. بيحاولوا إنهم يقولوا للناس إنه لا، هذا يعني هاي إسرائيل وطول عمرها إسرائيل وهدول إرهابيين، بس كل بيحبوا إنهم يفجروا حالهم ويقتلوا الأطفال ويقتلوا النساء. طبعا هذا يعني الإنسان العاقل بيعرف إنه هذا مش هي الحقيقة الموجودة هناك. العقوبات الجماعية، يعني واحد بضرب عليهم حجر بيجوا بيشيلوا بلد بحالها مثلا.
This was most graphically demonstrated in 2009 when Israeli troops attacked the Gaza Strip in order to halt rocket attacks, causing 1,400 Palestinian casualties, most of whom were civilian non-combatants and 300 of whom were children. In contrast, 13 Israelis died in the conflict, 4 from friendly fire. When we come back, whether the media portrays the Palestinian-Israeli conflict fairly.